you. Next, we'll hear from Councilmember Adams. Councilmember, you may begin upon the sergeant's announcement.
Starting time.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask a couple of more, if I can just get some yes or no responses, just to kind of drill down on this a little bit more. As far as your interpretation of this legislation is, Madam Chair, did you find in your interpretation of this legislation that there would be an installation of some sort of planning czar who would take over the decision-making process for communities?
I don't recall having seen in the legislation that there is a planning czar.
Neither did I. That would be a no. Thank you. Did you consider or find in this legislation any way, shape, or form, once again, that that decision-making would be taken away from communities and community boards?
Well, I very much see that within the legislation. If we look at the process, it is very heavily top-down. And as I mentioned before, the community board is presented with 3 options. And beyond that, when the recommended option goes to the council member can fundamentally change, the council can, and the council can fundamentally change what was put forward in the recommendation from the community board.
That's just factually not true.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please.
It's not true. That is just literally not accurate, Chair, of what the legislation says.
We would be glad to follow up. Obviously, we have different readings of
First of
the
all,
legislation.
It's not top down. We're empowering local communities to actually engage in planning instead of being reactive to city planning's certifying of private applications and public applications. So I don't know if we're going to have an honest conversation here today, we should be honest about what the legislation actually says. And what you just said, Madam Chair, is a complete and total misrepresentation of what the legislative text says and of what we have said consistently. So I am a little flabbergasted that you would think this doesn't change the ULURP process, it doesn't change the ULURP clock, it doesn't change the ability for community boards to weigh in, it does more planning, it creates more opportunities for public input. The current process is top down. The current process is city planning certifies an application and it goes to the community board with no or very little input pre-certification, except maybe scoping sessions that could happen for large-scale plans. This plan would create an ongoing dialogue with communities, community-based organizations, local stakeholders to constantly be talking about what do they want for their community. Do they want more school seats? Do they want more healthcare facilities? Do they want more types of affordable housing? That's what this plan calls for. We do not change the ULURP clock. We do not change community boards' ability to weigh in. We don't call for any particular type of zoning. All it does is say more community input from the bottom up, from grassroots neighborhood groups who can start to weigh in at the local level and proactively plan with their community boards, with their council members, and coordinate all of these plans. So I don't know if that was a willful misrepresentation, but it is literally, completely, and totally inaccurate to what the legislative text says inside of this bill.
With respect, Speaker, we disagree as to what is called for by the
We
plan.
can disagree on opinions, but we can't disagree on facts.
And again, we have a
the reading
disagreement of
bill
the
is
interpretation.
factual. The bill does not call for the ULURP process to be changed. The bill does not call for community boards to be cut out. The bill does not call for any particular type of zoning. The bill calls for further community engagement and input, which, as you heard earlier from multiple council members, people feel like is completely broken right now. And it calls for us to be able to plan in a comprehensive way to hopefully garner support from residents in communities who can have some type of say on what that proactive planning looks like. So to say that this takes away control from community boards, inaccurate, not factual, not what the bill says.
Again, Speaker, we disagree. We agree on the fact that it does not change ULURP. It adds an additional process on top of ULURP. We don't see the streamlining because we believe that any proposal, any specific project of any size will be going through the entire ULURP process and with, again, the requirement under state law for a separate environmental analysis. So we believe that the impact, the upshot, is going to be yet another impediment to the production of affordable housing at a time when we need to prioritize it, at a time when we need to prioritize the economic recovery from the pandemic.
That is a fine opinion to have. I'm not, you can have that opinion and that may actually be a worthy opinion. What I'm saying is your question to Councilmember Adams is your answer to Councilmember Adams' question was not what you just said right there. What you said right there could be a disagreement. We see a different path to actually potentially generating more affordable housing by getting buy-in from local communities on an ongoing process instead of a piecemeal reactive approach that we see right now. But I just want to be 1000% clear about what the legal language in the bill says. This does not diminish community boards. It does not call for any particular type of zoning. It does not change the ULURP process. It doesn't do any of those things. You all don't like the fact, it seems, that we are creating more public opportunities for engagement outside of the Department of City Planning, and that's a fine opinion to have. That's okay. I don't disagree with that. I mean, I may disagree with it, but you can have that opinion. I'm just trying to be factual on what this calls for. It doesn't call for a top-down approach. Right now, we have a top-down approach. Right now, city planning, in many instances without any consultation with community boards and council members, certify private applications that end up being almost fully baked by the time they get to the community board. The community board has 60 days to weigh in on that proposal. The community board issues an advisory opinion. The borough president issues an advisory opinion. In many instances, the city planning commission ignores those two advisory opinions and goes back to what the developer initially wanted in the certification application. And then the council member has to go back and do an amalgamation of what the developer's proposal was, what the community board called for, what the borough president called for. And I think that most council members and most community boards and most borough presidents typically see, not across the board, but in most instances, the city planning commission as a rubber stamp for the application that the city planning commission certified to go to the community board. So in many
Speaker,
ways,
first and foremost, I have to take exception with the notion of a rubber stamp.
We think of that as a top-down approach, that is the current process. What we're trying to say is we want to empower local communities to begin this process of asking what they want for long before a piecemeal, reactive pinball game of land use applications happens community district by community district. So I apologize for interrupting Councilmember Adams. I just wanted to be fully clear about what the legislation says. We can have a different opinion on if this is the best way to generate affordable housing. That's fine. There may be different opinions there, but it's factual about what the bill actually calls for process-wise.
Speaker, one, I have to take exception with the statement about the City Planning Commission being a rubber stamp. Anyone who watches our hearings sees the seriousness, the deliberation that is put in. With respect to the fact that this bill does not require any rezoning and keeps the status quo of ULURP there, the fact that it does not drive equitable change is a cause for concern, because we know that we do need more equitable allocation of affordable housing in city facilities. But Speaker, again, with respect, we cannot ignore the fact that the legislation allows the council at the time of adoption of the plan to make changes to the targets that have come forward, and that, as with the current ULURP process, which I agree remains absolutely unchanged under the bill, the final resolution of any application under ULURP is determined by the council, not
Yes,
by the community
exactly.
board.
We don't disagree on that. But I want to ask you a question. When's the last time the City Planning Commission voted down an application that came to it?
We voted down an application in Brooklyn. I don't know if it was 2019. And the other thing that, as you know, the same process occurs before the council, that applications are withdrawn when it becomes evident that it is not going to get a positive vote. But we did, in one instance, actually vote down an application.
I think that's a very rare occurrence, which is why I said it feels like more often than not, whatever the certified application is going into ULURP, the City Planning Commission, you may make some changes, you may make, from the review session and from the public hearings, but it's very, very rare and infrequent that the City Planning Commission actually votes down an application.
We work to improve applications, and Speaker, you may be aware of the fact that as chair, if an application is complete and the department disagrees with it, I, at the time of certification, express the department's opposition to the application.
I understand. Okay, I apologize, Councilmember Adams. I just wanted to be very clear on this. I know you were asking yes and no questions, and I want to be clear on your question. This does not diminish the role of community boards. It does not disempower community boards. It doesn't override community boards. The community boards would still have the same role in the ULURP process, and they would have more of a role to be able to participate in long-term comprehensive planning on an ongoing basis instead of in a reactive piecemeal way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. And I certainly appreciate your response in depth to that question. And Madam Chair, I'm sure that you have noticed today that there are a lot of us with community board experience, and we are very, very concerned about the way that community boards have been handled in the past, the lack of power for community boards. We will continue to fight for budgets for community boards, as well as I think that you heard that virtually from every council member that spoke today. I'm going to ask one more question of you again. It's a yes or no, I hope. And I again am trying to drill down to what is real in this legislation and what is being misrepresented by interpretation of this legislation, so we can just get all this out here. In your understanding of this legislation, will this bill, or does it have the potential, will it eliminate one-family zoning, single-family homes, affect low-density zones, with the ultimate goal of destroying single-home communities?
I think that the intent of the bill and the reality is that it would require considerations of changes to single-family neighborhoods in areas where there is rich transit access. But I don't think
this legislation as devastating? Do you see this legislation as devastating? That's some of the language I've heard also elsewhere and bandied about. You see this legislation as devastating to single-family communities?
I don't think that the legislation cannot at the same time say this is our flow for equity for having high opportunity neighborhoods absorb an equitable approach to meeting the city's growth needs, and at the same time say, but it will not make any changes anywhere. We know that ultimately any zoning change will go through ULURP and it will go to the council, which will make the ultimate determination. But to engage in a citywide planning effort at a time when we know the housing and affordable housing needs that we have, when we know the need for economic growth to recover from the pandemic, and say, but we start with a statement that we will not look at any single-family residents. I just don't see having it both ways.
This is
That's still not answering my question. Mr. Speaker, I defer to you.
This is shocking to me. In one instance, you're saying this plan does nothing. In the other instance, you're saying that we may be eliminating single-family zoning. You can't say both things because both things are untrue. I mean, I am flabbergasted. This is a total red herring and a complete misdirection by the Department of City Planning to come here today and say these things. I am shocked that this is what your on the record testimony is, to be truthful and for in front of the council. This you know, Councilmember Adams's question was, is this going to eliminate it? The answer is no. And then ultimately you said it would still be up to the council member to go through the Euler process. So is Councilmember Adams, are you going to eliminate single family zoning in your district? I don't think you are.
Speaker, Speaker, if I
Never.
could make sure that
That would never happen. As long as I'm in this seat, that would never happen, Mr. Speaker.
What I am pointing out is that ultimately any rezoning is the purview of the council. But in speaking about creating a citywide plan that needs to address the needs of a growing city and a city that needs housing, and in particular, affordable housing, it would strike me as an unusual conversation that says every single family zoning district is off limits. We could see that doesn't get to the fundamental issue of needing an equitable approach to address the areas of the city that are rich in transit. There are areas of the city, and again, we'll never get away from the fact that under our current system, it will be the council, and under the practice of council member deference, the council member that makes the determination. The nuance in my comment is that if we are to address issues of equitable distribution of city facilities and of affordable housing, one needs to have the discussion about where are high opportunity areas where it would be appropriate to look at this.
I'll just conclude with this, with all due respect, because I agree with the speaker. I think that the exchange has been very duplicitous. We are ultimately coming back down to council member deference and what is real and what is not real in this legislation. I think that we've had a lot of misrepresentation with this legislation. I think that a lot of people are confused, and quite frankly, Madam Chair, I don't think that you have helped the confusion at all, but I'm really glad that we are having this discussion today, because there is just there's just a lot of misguidance when it comes to this legislation.
Time expired.
Make sure that our community in particular, those of us who do reside in single home communities, do realize that we are there to preserve where we live, not to tear it down, and that is not what this legislation does. This legislation tends to empower. As a former community board chair, in my interpretation, this legislation tends to empower the community boards, as so many of us will continue to fight for, to continue to empower our residents and empower our community boards when it comes to land use discussions, and land use decisions. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Council Member.